said earlier, that I am very, very pleased to participate with all of you this evening. Welcome to those who are just joining us, and we'll get started. I must say first that it is quite an honor for me to have been asked to share with you and participate with you in today's webinar. So I think the project that is before you, as these webinars are part of, is a wonderful, wonderful project to be, again, as I said, involved in. And I'm honored that I can be at least in a small part of that process. I know that, and just looking over the project through Diverse Russia, the project that you're working on, that in the predicted outcomes, it talks about diversity in the classroom, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-linguistic Russian society, which you are, of course, and how you are able to work and appreciate each other's cultures in those many different ways that it's listed in these predicted outcomes, that I'm glad that I can be part of that. I'm going to be talking about predicted outcomes, expected outcomes as well, as they also relate to the federal standards that you have. And so today's session is called Lesson Development. And what I'll do is, this is really a technical webinar in how to put together a lesson plan that you can then obviously put into place in your instruction in the classroom. Now, we all do lesson planning, I know that, and but what I'll try to do is talk about it from my perspective. Maybe there'll be some ideas that you hadn't thought of. Please, if you have ideas, please share those as well throughout this webinar, either through questions or through the chat box or through comments of things that you're doing, so we can be in more of a group environment and share with each other. And I will try to put this in a cultural context as your outcomes have challenged us to do. So you'll see that I am now an English language specialist. I was 2 years based in Vladivostok as a senior English language fellow, getting to travel throughout the Far East and other areas within Russia. And so now I am doing independent consulting work in this field as well. You'll see that you have my website there, robdannon.com. I'll make reference to it. I'll also put it later on in the chat box, because there's many resources that are there available to you at any time. So let's get started. We'll be about an hour and a half in this webinar. I'll keep a close eye on the time because I know this is in the evening for you all. I appreciate you being here. So the first thing that I'd like to talk about, and the first thing that really what we all should be doing when we're planning our lesson, is thinking about it from the student's perspective. In other words, students are coming to your classes, to all of our classes, with ideas and questions about what is going to be taught to them. Now, these may be questions that they don't ask you, or they don't come up in the class, but we can pretty well assure that these are questions that they have. And these are some of the questions that as they enter your class, particularly for the first time or as you start a new unit, is why are we learning this in the first place? Why is it important to learn it? And am I going to be challenged to be thinking, or is it going to be something I already know and it's going to be boring to me? Also, how am I going to be graded? And how will I know myself if I'm doing a good job? And then the last question, it's not the last, but these are very similar or general questions, very common questions actually, that students are thinking. How will I know if my work is good and how can I improve it? Now, obviously, as we as teachers are going to tell our students that, but also just as important, if not more important, how will they know, the students themselves, if they're doing a good job? And so that's a skill that we want to teach our students. So those are questions that we need to be answering before they're even asked as we prepare a lesson and then use that lesson to instruct. And I'll go into that more in a little while. And I see that my website has been listed by Anastasia, so I appreciate that. And I'll make reference to my website throughout the lesson today or the seminar today. So again, the students are asking themselves certainly, why are we learning this? And it's important for us to appreciate that question from our students and then being able to answer that question from, again, in the development of our lesson and then from the very first steps within the actual lesson itself. And I'll talk about that from the anticipatory set part of the lesson later on in this webinar. But if we can answer that question at the very onset of the lesson, of the unit that we're starting, your students will not only be hooked into the lesson better, but they'll also most likely do a better job in the learning process. And let me just quickly read to you this quote by some researchers regarding that. This is what they say, and it's on the slide in front of us. They believe that learners benefit when the learning goals and objectives are explicit, that those learning goals and objectives, which we'll talk about later, are very clear to the students. As research has shown, students who do best in school are often those most adept, most capable at figuring out what the teacher wants. And we can help them figure that out by telling them up front what we expect of them and what they will learn. And we'll talk more about that. But that's a critical point to get our students hooked into learning. Now, as we start to develop the lesson, this is an area, a process of how to actually develop that lesson, which is called backwards design. If any of you are familiar with or use the notion of backwards design in your lesson planning process, would you please note that in the chat box now, just so we can see if others of you have done that or using that process. And I have it here. Let me see if I can bring it up where it can be seen better. Okay, I hope that you can see this template, this design in terms of backwards design. Yes, I see many of you are doing. So let me just quickly go through this and please share your thoughts, particularly those who use this as a way of planning. Now, backwards design is just what it says. It is when you're actually planning a lesson, you design it backwards from the way that you actually teach it. And how that goes is the first thing that you do is you, as it says in this slide, is identify desired results. In other words, this is where you start to think about your expected outcomes, your goals, your objectives of the lessons, the federal content standards that you may need to use for this particular lesson or unit. You think about those, and those are what you are going to focus on because that's what you want your students to learn. It's based on those expected outcomes. We'll talk more about that. Then once you have those decided, then the next step in the planning process is determining how the students will, and how will you know if the students actually have met and understand those expected outcomes, have been successful in learning those goals and objectives of the lesson. So this is where you start planning your assessments, your tests. You think about the projects that you're going to be doing within this lesson or within a unit that may take several days to complete. Also, in the chat box, if you'd be willing, list some other types of assessments or tests or evidence, evaluative tools that you use with your students to determine if they have met expected outcomes. And then once you have that, Then you actually plan your lesson, your typical lesson planning. And we'll talk about that process in a little while as well. And therefore, this is when, after you've determined your desired results, your outcomes, you determine how you're going to assess those outcomes, and then you're going to plan your actual lesson that will tie into directly into the assessments. Your lessons will be developed around those assessments that you've already decided on, and will connect, those assessments will connect more directly to your desired outcomes. Now, if we do that, if we plan backwards, we have a better chance of, when we're actually teaching, of meeting the teaching process up with the assessments, which will then directly connect to assessing the outcomes. We have a much better chance of aligning all of those than if we plan it the other way. So what we do is we plan backwards, but then we teach it forwards. So in other words, when you actually start to teach, you start from the bottom of planning, using your lesson plan, and then using your assessments to assess the outcomes to see if they've been reached. And so that is a process that we use. And I have this on my website as well. It's in the documents folder for this webinar as well. And so the next step I want to talk about is the actual instructional strategies that we use when we actually are using our lesson plan and teaching our lessons. Again, this is something that you may be familiar with. And so please let me know, let us all know if this is something that you have used, your feelings about it. And if you wouldn't mind putting your thoughts in the chat box. And before I go on, I have noticed that I don't see any chats at this time. But so I just want to make sure I'm still online with you. So if someone could acknowledge that, that would be great. Okay, good, good. There just weren't any chats. Okay, thank you. So let's talk about this. So for the instructional strategies, the very first one that we use is what we call, or at least here in the United States, we call direct instruction. And it's something that we all do, I know. And it's highly teacher-directed, it's teacher-centered, it's not student-centered. And what it is it's when we lecture in our classrooms, when we do most of the talking. We provide the information, as it says here, step-by-step directions of what we want our students to know. When we're introducing new ideas, new skills. Oh, okay, I see. Direct instruction is a Soviet style of teaching. Yes, and I am familiar with that in my work and observations in Russia. I know your federal standards are trying to emphasize more student-centered instruction, which we talked a lot about when I was in Russia. But direct instruction, even though student-centered instruction is important, and we'll talk more about that, I still believe, and let me know if you believe the same, that direct instruction is just as important. Right. And so many teachers in Russia, it says here, only know the style and is used most. And that's true. Here in the United States, that's true as well. The thing about it, though, is while it's important to use, as this person mentioned in the chat box, it's also, sometimes we use it too much. And we'll talk about a balance between that. But when we're teaching new skills, new concepts, new ideas, new terms to our students, we as teachers need to be in charge of the instruction. And so it lays the foundation of how, those skills being used later by the students. So it's very important that we start with that, particularly when something is new that we're teaching. And I have an example here. Teaching relevant vocabulary words in order to read a story during class. That would be an example of direct instruction if the teacher is highlighting those vocabulary words, providing the definitions of what those words mean, if the students don't know it. So that would be one example of direct instruction. Could you quickly in the chat box list other types of activities you do in your classrooms that would be considered direct instruction? I am waiting to see if anybody is willing to enter anything in the chat box. Oh, here we go. Pre-listening. Great. Um, yes, people are typing it now. Explaining grammar. That's very much a direct instruction theme when we're teaching the skill sets that go along with grammar. I see a lot of people are using that as an example. Definition of complex concepts. Yes, when students need that information and they don't have access to it, it is our job to directly instruct it. Great, explaining course curriculum. Perfect, thank you. I also had listed as teaching grammar and syntax, and thank you for adding to this list. That's great. I'll ask you for your input as we go along. Thank you for doing that. So now another instructional strategy, which is very, very important, I think, and is something that we don't do enough of, I think, but we need to really keep a closer mind to this, pay greater attention to it, is inquiry. And that's the heart of questioning and the focus of questioning. As it says there, it says questioning is the heart of inquiry learning. How to ask questions, how not to be afraid to ask questions because we do not know something. How to know when we ask questions of our students that students fully understand what we're asking and the responses they're giving. While questioning is the heart of inquiry, I think that inquiry is the heart of learning. And I'll talk more about that. And so they gather information by the questions that are asked by you or by them, and the answers that are given by you or by them. And there's one word that I think is the most important word when we teach. It's a three-letter word in English. Can you guess what word I'm thinking of when we talk about questioning and asking for answers? It's a three-letter word. There it is. I see it right away. The question is why? That's exactly it. And so that word why to me is very, very important. Let me explain why it is. So in my example that I have, students are asked to support their opinion with either facts, statistics, or examples. So when a student answers a question, if they don't explain why they have given that answer, I think it is our job as teachers to ask them, even if the question's correct, that's great. Tell me why you feel that. Because for two reasons. One, it gives the student a chance to reflect and think deeper on the reason that they gave that answer. And it gives them a quick check to make sure that their answer makes sense to them. And the other part is it gives you a quick informal assessment of their answer. Did they guess at the answer, or did they give you a good reason as to why they answered it the way they did? And so when you ask them to give their opinion, there's no right or wrong with an opinion generally, but ask them to support it either through facts, statistics, or examples of what they mean. That to me is quite critical. It says here, some of my students are afraid of the word why because they understand they have to make a complete sentence, not just yes or no. But yes, it is a challenge. And also it's part of our job. Sometimes if we ask the question why, we shouldn't ask it in a way that the students feel that they're being challenged or that you're angry at them for wanting them to give you more information. It's just a way, and it can be explained to them that want you to be thinking about the reasons that you gave. And it is then good practice for them if they're, let's say, using another language to be able to share that. And if they're speaking in Russian, that's fine too. The heart of this is really to get them to think about their answers and do they make sense. So, is there any other things? I have examples here of students providing facts, statistics, or examples to support their answers. Can you think of other things that can also support the answers that students come up with? Giving arguments and counter arguments? Yes. Debating is a wonderful way of doing that. Quotes from stories, another good one. You know, as we're listing some ideas here, giving arguments and debates is a wonderful thing. Also, I don't know if you're familiar with a process called Socratic Seminar. I have that on my website at robdannon.com, a section on Socratic Seminar, which is a different approach to debating, but it goes along some of the same lines. You may want to look at that. Providing tables, pictures, things like that. Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. Research and surveys is another good one too. Another one is action research, which is a whole process both for teachers for professional development opportunities, but also for students to do research in the classroom, and it's called action research. And I have a whole section of action research on my website if you're interested to look at. So I'm going to move on, talk a little bit more about inquiry. Because when we talk about that, this is some of the things that help their students in their learning process. It helps with their curiosity when they have to ask questions or answer questions. And it helps them to develop good questioning techniques themselves. And now the next three, particularly I want to focus on because it does tie into the cultural perspective of what these webinars are all about. Thinking the students' way through controversies or dilemmas, looking at problems analytically, and inquiring about their preconception or misconceptions about things that they may be thinking about or already know. And so those three, those right there, controversies, dilemmas, thinking about things through clearly and analytically, and looking at preconceptions are the heart in so many ways of how we look at culture, our culture compared to other people's culture. And that may help us to alleviate some of the prejudices that we have, if we can talk through some of these things, as well as appreciate the differences and the similarities that different cultures have. And that can be done through brainstorming, as Natalia has mentioned here. So I think this does tie in well to the focus of this project. And then also the use of a KWL chart is a great, simple tool to use throughout many different forms of instruction, but for inquiry, it really works well here. Are any of you familiar with the use of a KWL chart? If so, I see someone says, no, well, let me show you one right here. Let me see if I can bring it up so it can be seen better. Okay, that one is, I'm going to go back. That one I have on my website, so you can access it too. Let me see if I can get back to, yeah. This one is a little bit easier to see now, but I have this on my website. It's a little bit different format. You can Google KWL chart and find them, but they're very, very simple. People are saying, I've used it. Yeah, let's talk about why it's called KWL. You'll see the first column. That's the K column, and then there's a W column and the L column. Well, let's go back to the K column. That is how you use this. It's a very simple process, and I see that many of you have used it. Is when, let's say we're studying a new unit. And so on that very first day that we're going to start studying, I can have this up on a whiteboard or on a chart. And this could be done through direct instruction by the teacher. I ask my students, and this is all part of inquiry now, okay, this is our topic. What do we know? What do I as a student already know about this topic? And so have the students, someone said brainstorming, have the students list in a brainstorming fashion, you write down the things they already know about this topic. That's pre-knowledge, prior knowledge. One, it gives them an idea to get focused on the topic, saying, oh, I already know some things about it. And for you, you can use it to see how much the students already have pre-existing knowledge about that topic. So if most of the students already know certain things that they're listing, you don't have to spend the time and bore the students by teaching about that. You may review it, but you go on and teach about other things that they don't know. And that's what the W part of the KWL chart is. After they've listed what they already know about the topic, then what you do is you say, okay, students, thank you for sharing what you already know. What is it that you want to know, that you may have some ideas about but want to know better or don't know anything at all about this topic that we're going to be studying? And this is where the students list these things that they want to know about the topic. And then it's what they're doing is they're helping you plan your lesson or your lessons for this unit, because you may say to yourself, oh, I was already going to teach them some of these things, but here are some other ideas that I hadn't even thought of that students may be interested in. I will make sure that we include those in the lessons as well. And if you find at the end of the unit you didn't get to answer all of what I wanted to know, because you may go back and check that list with the students, maybe some of the students can take individual projects and find out the answers to the remaining questions, and then come back and report back to the class. And that W section of what I want to know could be increasing, because as they learn more, they're going to have more questions. So that's how you start a topic. And then the L is what I've learned. And I'm going to not talk about that right now. I'm going to come back to that near the end of this webinar, because that is a way to bring a closure to the lesson or the unit itself. So I'll come back to that. It says here, but if they know too little and don't want to know much, well, hopefully the activities and the projects you have will stimulate them wanting to know more. So I think that's a part of it. That's a good question for us to keep in mind as teachers of how do we engage our students. One way is through the inquiry, and I'll try to bring up some other ideas. Please share some of yours as well. It says here, we've been using it after some seminars of ELO. That's great. So the use of a KWL chart. Let's just spend just a few minutes, because I have so much I want to cover with you. If someone would put, or anybody just add in the chat box, let's just come up with a little chat activity. Think of a culture-based program or unit or a lesson that you are planning to teach or have taught, and just list it in the chat box. And one of the first ones that come up, I will use that as an example. So if anybody wants to think about a culturally based activity, a lesson or unit that you are teaching or have taught or will be teaching, please list that. Great, I'm starting to see some responses. Okay, let's take this one. Irina has national stereotypes. And thank you for those who are listing them, because it's great ideas for us to share with each other, that you may want to pick up and use in your own classrooms later. But let's use this for a very simple exercise that we're going to do here. Okay, we'll do a little role play now. I'll be the teacher, you be the students, and I'm going to say to you, okay, students, we're going to be talking about national stereotypes here in Russia. We're going to do a unit on this over the next couple of days. And so students, before we get started on the actual unit, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. The first question, and I have a chart here, it's called a KWL chart, and I'm going to be listing your responses. So the first thing I want to ask you students is, what do you already know about stereotypes that we have here in Russia regarding different cultures? So now I'm actually back to being me. If you could list in the chat box some things you already know, you as the seminar participants, about national stereotypes. Okay, Russians are friendly, which they are. Felt very warm and accepted while I was there. Numerous, quite a few. Okay, and other nationalities is French. Right, great. And see, so thank you for sharing and keep on sharing so we all can see what you already know. And again, me as then the teacher could say, oh, okay, I hadn't even thought about French. Maybe we can do some comparative. See, you're as students are giving me as the teacher ideas of what we can talk about and what you already know. So again, maybe I don't have to spend as much time on those things and spend more time on other things that you don't know yet. So then, great. Now let's go on to the next one. Okay, students, thank you for sharing with me what you know about national stereotypes. What do you want to know? What are some things you're curious about that you haven't had a chance to learn about or know about? Please tell me what some of those things are, and we'll try to get to them throughout the course of this unit. So if you can list now in the chat box some things you want to know. I see some, Elena says, Americans always smile, but their smiles are not sincere. Well, my smile right now is sincere. And I know I've heard that often, and that's true in many ways. It's part of our nature to smile. When we're friendly, but we're not overly friendly in that regard, as a smile might say. But that's not always true. But many a time it is. And here's why chucha, if I'm saying it right, is used with negative connotation. Yeah, why is there more negative stereotypes than positive ones? Wow, I never thought of that. That's great. And see, so now we're listing, and continue to list if you would, what I want to know, what you want to know, and we can incorporate that into the lesson, and then come up with that. And I mean, the one about there are more negative than positive stereotypes is one, again, I hadn't thought of, and so that's a great challenge for all of us. But why do we have stereotypes in the first place? And so, thank you. And so you see how this process can work. And I'll come back to what I've learned. But thank you for sharing. I mean, this is a learning process for us right now. I'm walking away at the end of this webinar with thoughts and ideas that I didn't have before. So thank you. This is truly a professional development opportunity, and I appreciate it spending this time with you. So let's go on to the next area is of instructional strategies, which is guided practice, which is just what it says, is guided support by the teacher. What we call in the United States sometimes is scaffolding. And the whole idea of guided support and scaffolding really came about through Lev Vygotsky. And so he is an educational theorist from your country, of course, who here in the United States, we have been using his methods and his research. When I started studying to be a teacher 35 plus years ago, we worked on Vygotsky's theory of scaffolding and many other theories that he has. And to this day, here in America, we still use his theories, both in training of teachers and in our own professional development. And the whole idea of if scaffolding is I think probably an American term that we use. You know, scaffolding is that the metal structure that goes on outside of a building that's being built that provides support while the building is being completed, and then that scaffolding is taken away once the building is completely done. And that's why we use that term, because we provide that support while the students are learning. And the students can provide that support to each other as well. And then once the students have gained the knowledge, then we can take the scaffolding away. And that support can be done either through informal or formal means. Informal could just be observing and giving answers and support to the students or the students to each other. Formally giving support could be more in terms of actual projects that are being done, and then seeing how well the students do it and then giving them the support they need if they need it. And it's a way for us to make sure that they're ready for what we call independent practice. It's our way, as the slide says here, of checking for understanding. And do the students really understand the instruction that I gave them through independent practice? And if so, are they ready to move on? And so that's what guided practice is. That's the next step after independent practice. Here's an example that I have. Students individually or in pairs work on drawing a picture incorporating characteristics they learned about in the lesson. And so this way you can see by their activity if they are beginning to understand or fully understand the concepts that you taught them. And if so, are they ready to move on in their learning and their understanding? And so other examples I'm starting to see here: make dialogues in pairs and use vocabulary that's learned. That's great. Incorporating those skills, those vocabulary, those concepts in the actual process and seeing if they can do it without your help. If they need your help, that's great. Generally, before they're ready to go independent, they need that support from you particularly, but also from each other. Building a community within the classroom for supporting one another. Creating stories, making a short poem, using a grammar that's being taught. Write an essay on the topic discussed. Thank you. And as you can see, these chat responses, great for sharing these. These are ones that many of them I've thought of myself, so hopefully they're due to some of us as well. So keep listing those. I appreciate it. Now we're going on to the final stage of instruction strategies, and that's independent practice. And that's just as the slide says, it's or what the term is when the students now, after they've done the guided support, they are now ready to go on and do it on their own and show you and show them that they have understand the skills and can apply it independently. And this teaches self-reliance and self-improvement, gives them a chance to know whether they can do it, as well as letting you know. So you plan independent practice activities and lessons and projects that they should be able to do on their own. And I have here very little, if at all, guidance. And really, true independent practice should not have any guidance by the teacher. If the guidance is still needed, that means the students still need more guided practice. Ideally, independent practice is they have now take the skills and the instruction that you've provided them and can now apply it on their own. And this is a good place to use formal assessments, such as tests and projects, essays. Many of the things that you have been listing in the chat box can certainly be used for formal assessments to show independent understanding of what they're learning. It says here that people like to use Venn diagrams, and that's my example. Is students will complete a Venn diagram in English, categorizing similar characteristics of various cultures studied in class. And so I see people do appreciate Venn diagrams. Again, another simple process. I have a template on my website that you can use. And most of the things that I'm referring to when I say my website are under the lesson development section of my website. There's many other topics as well. Feel free to use. They're there for you to do that. But these things that relate to this webinar are under what's called the lesson development section of my website. Some people say they don't know what a Venn diagram is. Well, I'm glad you said that because here, let me show you. There we go. Now, it may seem familiar to you. I'm sure most of you have seen what this is. This is on the left, that's a Venn diagram. And what it basically is representing is it's either circles or ovals like here, and you have two different topics, two different ideas, two different concepts. You have concept A, concept B, and they are different, or they appear to be different from each other. But what we find in many cases is that there are some similarities to what we think are two totally different concepts or ideas. And what you do is you find that overlap, as this Venn diagram shows, that you have where there are differences, yes, that's shown, but where there are similarities, we are able to recognize those. And so that's what a Venn diagram is supposed to demonstrate. Now, if you look at on the right, the artifact that we have there, I'm sorry, the Venn diagram, the example that we have there shows a Venn diagram. And you can have more than two circles or ovals. You can have as many different concepts and seeing where they intersect and where they are. There are some similar characteristics. So since the project that we're all involved in here is based on culture and cultural appreciation, I wanted to use this as an example. So what you can use, how you can use this Venn diagram if you're teaching cultural differences and tolerance and appreciation of different cultures, is you talk about the different cultures. And what you'll find is the different artifacts, the different items, the different tools that cultures have. And you can be talking about them and learning about them, about the different cultures within Russia itself. And then also discussing the values of those cultures and what is important to each particular culture that you're studying. And then the assumptions. What do those cultures, based on their artifacts and their values, what are some of the things that are so important to them or vital to the sustaining of their culture? And so there may be differences, and clearly there will be differences within different cultures. But also, what are the similarities? What are some of the same values that we share? We may express them differently or act on them differently, but we have the underlying assumptions are the same. Sometimes we find that vast cultures from vast areas of the world share similar tools. You see cultures from different parts of the world that seem worlds apart having same types of tools, totems, those sorts of things that you would never expect to happen. And so what you're doing is you're trying to find and appreciate and celebrate the differences, but also appreciate the similarities. That helps with tolerance. That helps with appreciation because it's something we understand within our own culture. An example for me, when I was in Russia, I got to travel to the Kamchatka Peninsula a couple of times when I was there. And when I visited some indigenous villages, I noticed that many of the things there were very similar to the Eskimo population in Alaska. And so we all have experiences that we find things that we didn't think there were similarities that there really are, and it brings us closer together. And so this is what a Venn diagram can do. And hopefully this would give some help, particularly as we focus on cultural diversity and appreciation. Yes, Contra is actually close to Alaska. And there was talk about, in a book that I'm reading about Russia right now, talks about the land bridge up by the Bering Strait, where, well, actually the book says that North America and South America, the first peoples that ever came to North and South America came from Siberia. That's what anthropologists believe, and they came across land bridges up by the Bering Strait. And thank you, Russia, for giving us Alaska many years ago. So this is just an example of how Venn diagrams can be used. So now let's just do a quick overview of the instructional strategies, quick summary. And so what I want to talk about here is just highlighting what we just talked about. And this is like a little cheat sheet to remember these things in the process in which to start from new instruction all the way through formal assessment. And the first one, of course, is direct instruction when you introduce new material. And as we talked about, that's highly teacher-directed, teacher-centered. Then once we've done that, and again, as people have said in the chat box earlier, we have to be careful not to overuse direct instruction. But once we feel like we have laid that foundation for the students to start practicing what we're teaching them, that's when they use guided practice and provide support and scaffolding. Now, guided practice is both teacher-centered and student-centered because you're there to help them when needed, but they're there to try to do it on their own as best they can. And then the last step is independent practice, where this is a good place to do formal assessments. Some of the assessments that we talked about and others where the students do a project, do an essay, do a movie, some of the wonderful things that you shared on their own. It can even be done in small groups, but you want to make sure that students can do it on their own as well. And that's very student-centered. With really no, preferably, teacher-directedness at all. You've done the hard work, now it's their turn to show you what they've learned. And another way to summarize this overview is what I have up here is called, as it says, model, coach, and fade. In other words, under direct instruction, we as the teachers are modeling what the key concepts are that they need to learn. And then we coach them during the guided practice. Let them try to do it, but give them the coaching that they need if they need it. And then we fade into the background. We don't go away during independent practice, but we fade. We move into the background and they come forward and they share with us and each other what they have learned through the process of your teaching. So that's a quick overview of the instructional strategies. Right, student autonomy. That's exactly it. And so if Tatiana, yeah, if you could explain what PPP means. Presentation, practice, production. Oh, okay. I'd never heard it that way, but thank you for sharing. Presentation, practice, and performance. Great. Great, thank you. I've learned something. Thank you again for sharing. It says here, I like the word fade. That's what many teachers can't do. It's hard. Our job, many of us, I mean, why we went into teaching is because that is our job, is to teach. But sometimes and it's hard, but I really believe we need to give up control. By us giving up control back to the students, we're teaching them skills that they're going to use beyond our classroom and other classrooms within their professional lives after school. Those who are professionals that you're teaching now, and life skills. That's part of our job too, is to get them to be able to be self-reliant and be able to use the skills that we have taught them and generalize those skills in other areas. So by us giving up control, we're actually giving more control to the students, which is our ultimate goal in their learning. So I hope that we can understand that we still are in control, but we choose to give up that control. Okay, so let's move on. And thank you for putting ideas in the chat box so we all can see. Now, I want to talk about, we've talked about the instructional strategies and the processes. Now, how and when to use these things, as we've been talking about, comes down to pacing. And so lesson pacing is, we all know what that is when you're learning new information, as it says here in the slide, we need to take more time and deal with the as much time as we need with teaching those discrete skills, so we can build that foundation for students to be able to use those skills on their own later on. So obviously we're going to spend more time on that at the beginning, or if students are confused and need further clarification. But then as we get into guided practice and independent practice, our pace can be picked up. We don't have to spend so much time on each concept. We're applying those concepts now. The students become more engaged, more motivated, so the process can move along quicker. And we need to find a balance. It's a key to that, is really finding a balance between those two things. And if we're going too fast, as it says, as can be tolerated by the student, if we go too fast, then the students become frustrated and they lose motivation and engagement. And that's an important thing, is student motivation, particularly if you're teaching a foreign language. We know how quickly, if you are getting confused or you don't understand a concept, that you can't build on that because you need more time to work on the things you don't understand. So we have to monitor and adjust. We have to reteach when needed. But also we don't want to go too slow where students are losing motivation because it's boring. So it's just practice. It's finding that balance between the two. Whatever instructional strategies that you use. Oh, it says here, life skills are supposed to come to Russia school soon. That's great. That's great. That's very student-centered. That's exciting. Now let's talk about learning time. It's a thing that we call here in the United States wait time. And that means is, how long does a teacher actually wait when they pose a question to their students? How long do they wait before the teacher themselves gives the answer if the students don't? Now, they've done studies here in the United States on that. And they did studies with teachers, and they came up through these studies to find out the average time a teacher waits after they've asked a question of their students before the teacher themselves gives the answer. Take a guess what that time amount is, if you put it in the chat box. So again, that the study found that teachers on an average wait a certain amount of time before they will give the answer themselves. What do you think that is? Take a guess and put it in the chat box. 10 seconds. Okay, anybody else want to take a guess? Two seconds? And so 5 seconds? Okay, thank you for guesses. And but in this study, what they found is teachers typically wait 1 second. 1 second. If they don't get an answer right away, they will give the answer. 1 second. And so that's pretty amazing. And what they have found in this same study is if you wait 3 to 7 seconds, if the teacher waits 3 to 7 seconds after they pose a question, they will generally get somebody in the class to respond. And most of the times it's the correct response. But they'll get somebody to respond, and then the conversation and other questions and responses come once that first person provides a response. So what we need to do as teachers is take that time, think about it yourself. How long do you actually wait if someone doesn't give you an answer right away before you give the answer? Or you turn to another student to give the answer. If we wait 3 to 7 seconds, you will generally find that that will occur. And I'm just going to do with you right now, I'm going to pretend like I'm posing a question, and I'm going to wait 7 seconds. I'm not going to say anything purposely for 7 seconds. Let's all count out 7 seconds, starting from now. There, that was 7 seconds. Seems like eternity, doesn't it? Particularly if you're standing in front of a classroom, 7 seconds seem like forever. And someone was saying we always feel like we're in a hurry, but sometimes if we go slow, we're actually going faster because we're giving time for people to process and to come up with correct answers, and so there's less questions later on, so we're gaining that time back. And so so even though 7 seconds does seem like a long time, if you wait those 7 seconds, you will generally get an answer. When I do presentations and I pose a question, I will count to myself 7 seconds before I make any sort of response. And almost all the time, somebody in the audience or somebody in the class will actually respond. And particularly if you're asking higher level thinking questions, complex questions, none of us can answer that off the top of our heads. Even as adults, even as teachers, we need time to process the question and the different facets and the different concepts that go into answering that question. And that takes a few seconds to do that, at least. So if you feel that, well, it's too awkward to wait in complete silence for 7 seconds, tell your students, I've just asked you a hard question. I'm going to give you a little bit of time to process the question, and then when you're ready, if someone would please respond. Then that takes away the awkwardness because you've already given them permission to be quiet and be thinking about it. Now, some things they can answer in a second. If it's something rote, memorization, skills that you've been teaching them, yeah, those things should come off the top of their head. But when you're asking particularly higher level thinking skills, we all need time to process. Great, so let's move on. So a few other things I'd like to talk about pacing, and some of these have a cultural perspective to them, is, and I'll let you read these on your own and make comment if you want to. But how we can do some informal assessing of if we're going too slow, too fast, or just enough is sometimes we just make misjudgments about how ready students are to move on to guided practice or independent practice. That's fine. And that's all part of monitoring and adjusting. And then we just find out by either the questions that a student's asking. If they're asking lots of questions, then obviously they need more guided practice or maybe more independent practice. So we adjust and do more of that. If students are asking the same questions over and over again, that might mean that we didn't really teach that or teach it well, and that's okay. We just go back and do that as teachers. Because if we don't, as I said, the lack of motivation and engagement, if we are not trying to balance the pacing that we have, will allow students to daydream, to not pay attention, and that sort of thing. So let's move on. Now I want to talk about, at the start of the lesson, going back to that, because remember the questions I said at the beginning, what are students learning? Excuse me, what are students asking? These are the questions that they're asking. Why are we learning this? And I had mentioned anticipatory set. That's a term that we use here in the United States. It's a way, as it says here, to get the students' attention. It's where we answer that question from the very beginning to our students. Students, the reason why we're learning this today, or this unit that we'll be learning over the next several days, is this. You tie it into your expected outcomes, what you want your students to have at the end. You give them a brief overview of the importance of what they're going to be learning. 3 minutes. You take 3 minutes at the beginning of the lesson to do that. You know, some of you may very well and understandably say, I don't have those 3 minutes. But again, if you go slow to go fast, those 3 minutes that you have to get the students focused and to answer that question of why we're doing this, well, you will gain more time than those 3 minutes because you'll have less questions later on, less confusion, less reteaching. So you'll gain back that time and more. And some ways to get the start of the lesson going is through warm-up activities. And so I'm sure you're familiar with warm-up activities. Many of you I know use those. And warm-up just means that, you know, you're warming up the brain. It's like warming up an engine in a car. You're getting the students focused, their thinking going related to the lesson at hand. And many of you probably use warm-up activities. If you're doing dictionary skills, there's dictionary warm-up activities, writing activities, spelling, and even cultural activities that are just quick and easy. They're fun. It's getting them to review the skills that they already have to get them focused again. And they're 3 to 5 minutes. You don't take a grade on them. It's just something that maybe you pick one for the beginning of each lesson and get them focused on it. And you pick different ones to change things up for them. And you can just Google warm-up activities, EFL, or in any other foreign language, and you'll get so many different resources. I've listed a really good one here, and I'm going to put it. Oh, I see that it's already there. Great. I was going to put that. Thank you for listing it. If you click on this one, and I have this in my website as well, this has lots of them. I went ahead and evaluated a lot of these different links, and this is one of the better ones that I came up with. So I wanted to save some time for you. And it has to do particularly with ESL, English as a Second Language, as we call it here in the United States, or EFL. If it's outside of the United States. And it has all of these dictionary writing and spelling and other warm-up activities. Even you'll find some cultural activities if you search throughout that website. And you can take some of their ideas and turn them into cultural perspective at warm-up activities. Mind mapping is a very effective one. Yes, that's a very good way to warm up. Thank you for sharing that, Tatiana. So now we're coming to the end of the lesson, the wrap-up of the lesson. That's the closure that I was talking about. And again, if you take 3 to 5 minutes to bring closure to the lesson, we just talked about in the slide before, here I'll show it to you, the anticipatory set. At the beginning, we're going to tell the students what we're going to learn today, and now we're going to, at the end of the lesson, at the end of the unit, and I'd say you do it every day at the end of each lesson, even if it's part of a unit, you wrap up. You do a quick summary of that day's lesson. And again, you take no more than 3 minutes, and it's worth the time. I know how busy and how tight your schedules are and what you have to teach. What I would say, to me, it's the analogy that I use is like bookends. The anticipatory set is one of those bookends. I'm trying to show you. And then the wrap up is the other bookend. And you know, like when you have books on the shelves, and if you have them between two bookends, they stay nice and tight, nice and neat. And if you don't, they kind of are disarrayed on your bookshelf. Well, that's what I think anticipatory set does and wrap up. It makes that lesson very tight and neat. And what you do is, and it's part of your learning, that students learning, you ask students, this is very student-centered, you say, okay, students, who can share with me some of the key points of this lesson today? What are some of the main ideas? And you let them answer that. Or you ask students to draw conclusions from today's lesson. What do you think about what we've learned today and why? An important word, why. Ask students how they're going to use this information. Again, don't give them those answers. Let them process it and reflect and internalize what's been taught. So that's very student-centered. And you ask different types of closure questions on different days. You won't get to every student, but each day you pick on different students to answer. And that just brings the lesson to an end, the unit to an end in a nice way. And it lets you know also as the teacher, what did they get? Did they actually get some of the things that you wanted them to understand at the end of each lesson? A very quick informal assessment for you. Then you can also preview future lessons. You can say, tomorrow, we're going to build on today's lesson by talking about and learning about this. That could be part of your closure too. It's almost doing an anticipatory set at the end of the lesson that you're going to also state at the beginning of the next lesson. And so I'm trying to just see what we have here in terms of some of the comments. Great. Okay, so let's move on. So now we've talked about the lesson itself, the development of the lesson, the delivery of the lesson. So what I have here, and you really can't see them very well, are lesson plan templates. Let me see. I also have these and more under the lesson development section of my website where you can print out and actually use and see better. Let me see if I can get this template. No, I don't know if you can see that very well. I'm going to go back. And again, these are on my website. This is a lesson plan that I developed when I was working in Korea, South Korea. We were working with in a project that involved English immersion, and the teachers and I came up with this lesson plan template. You really can't see it, but I'm just going to highlight here. Let me see if I can use this marker. Oh. Okay, I'm just going to note, and again, if you want to go into my website and see this better, that some of the different aspects. Up here is where you can put your goals and objectives, which we're going to talk more about, your outcomes, expected outcomes. Over here, that's over here. Over here is the actual lesson activities that you'll be doing. And then over here, for pacing, how much time for each activity do I think I'm going to need? And then we can adjust that as needed. And then over here is materials that I'm going to use with the students. And it's a good thing to list those so we don't forget to have them when we're ready and not when we're not looking for them during the lesson itself and wasting time. And so this is some of the aspects within this template. Let me go over here and show you the second part of this first template. Up here is places we decided to use this if we used websites. We listed the websites here so we would have them readily available. And then someone asked in the chat, do we always follow our lesson plans? No, because sometimes we need to monitor and adjust. That's a great question. So we have ideas. We use it as a script, as an outline, but we make the adjustments as necessary because some things come up that we just don't know. And we need to not just go through our lesson plan without paying attention to what our students need, but we make those adjustments as needed. And if we don't get to everything, then we pick up where we left off and continue the next lesson. And that's where this ties in. I talked about students being reflective in answering questions. Teachers need to be reflective in the work that they do as well. We need to model how to be reflective for our students so they can be as well. And this is where you take notes. You can write them as you're teaching a lesson. You can do it right after the lesson where it's still fresh in your mind. And here you write down what worked in this lesson. So I remember to use those strategies and techniques at another time. And then what didn't work and why? Why didn't it work? And what do I need to do to make it work for me the next time? Or maybe it was an idea that I shouldn't have used at all and I'm not going to use again. But if it's something that I really think is important, but it didn't work, why didn't it work? And down here is what would I do differently next time? So this allows us to make changes to our lesson plan because as the person asked, we're not always going to necessarily follow it exactly for whatever reason. And this is another lesson plan template that's also on my website. It's hard to see, I know. And this is what we call a SIOP lesson plan. SIOP stands for Sheltered and Structured Observational Protocol, a big term which doesn't really say what it's supposed to. But SIOP is a process that we use here for ESL. Our ESL teachers use it. And this has a lot of the same things, even more than the other template that I showed you. You wouldn't necessarily use this. I mean, you could, but there's just so much in here. Everything that I mentioned and more talks about when to use guided practice, when to use what types of assessments, or what kind of scaffold am I going to use, what kind of vocabulary am I going to have. All the things that I talked about in the other one and more. So I would suggest that if you're interested to look at this on my website, I have it as a template. You can print it out and use it if you'd like, or at least adapt it. I may have mentioned this, what kind of assessments am I going to use? It's very, very thorough. It goes into here. This is down in here is where you put your actual lesson plan. Right here, the pacing, the materials, any differentiation I may need for different students' needs. The review, the closure, as I mentioned, anticipatory set at the beginning of the lesson. It's very, very thorough. You may find it very useful. Okay, let's move on. And then a lesson plan rubric. I see we're quickly running out of time, so I want to move on. This is a rubric I developed. It's on my website. And if you want to judge your lesson plans based on this rubric, there's from Proficient, which is right here. Means I've put together a good lesson plan. I need to work on it. There's some areas that need improvement, or the lesson didn't work very well, or the plan isn't really written as well as I want it to be. And I have areas in terms of what are my standards I'm going to use, what are my outcomes, what are my objectives, and then the actual teaching of the lesson. What do I have all the necessary parts to the lesson? And then the reflective part also as well. And you can make comments and you can judge your own ability and skill level in terms of developing rubrics. If you're working with pre-service teachers and they're developing lesson plans, feel free to use this. It's on my website and you can just download it if you'd like. Are our plans controlled by school authorities? Yes, not to the extent that it is in Russia. Yours is more at the federal level. Ours is more at the local level, and sometimes even down to the own school itself. We are controlled a little bit by the federal government, more so by the state government, and then even more so by the individual school districts. And then within the schools themselves, do have some flexibility. Even in your classroom, you have some flexibility as to how you're going to teach. Thank you for asking questions. I'm going to just take a quick breather here. There's my website again. And again, all of this that we've been talking about is under lesson development. I'm going to move on though, and I want to talk a little bit about goals and objectives. And so, as we said, that's the expected outcomes. And so let's do that now. Why bother? Why talk about or even think about the necessity of having goals and objectives? As the website for Diversity Russia has their expected outcomes, so they focus on what hopes to be accomplished during this project. We in our classrooms should be doing the same. So goals and objectives help us to determine if the goals that we have for our students are actually being taught and they're actually being learned. And there is a difference between the two, between goals and objectives. And that's something we as teachers sometimes mistake. And it's better to understand the reason and the necessity of having goals and objectives. They're not the same. Goals are more broad and generalized statements of what's to be learned. A way to think about it is, as it says here, is a target to be reached. So they're broad and generalized. Think of it as an umbrella. This is where I hope to reach. And under this umbrella is all the things I'm going to do to help us reach those goals. Here are some examples of goals. Students will understand how to identify a compound word. Students will know appropriate language, variety, register, and genre. Students will learn grammatically correct phrases. Notice it's highlighted, will understand, will know, will learn. These are goals. This is what we hope our students will be able to do. Now, objectives is the steps in which we're going to reach those goals. While their goals are general, objectives are specific and can be measurable. It's what the student is actually doing, can be observed. It's the actions they're doing. So they can be quantified. So things like understand, this is under the tip part of the slide, appreciate, learn, and other things that are general, that are too vague. They're important because that helps us to understand what we want to do, but you can't observe those things. You can't observe appreciation in itself or understanding. You need to have actual measurable steps that show that they understand something, and that's what an objective does. And that's the importance. This is something you can't really read, I don't think, but I have this on my website. On this left-hand column, this one here, it says ambiguous words, but these are generalized terms. These would be very good for goals, such as value, develop, enjoy, appreciate, determine, know. Those are things we want them to do, but we can't measure them in and of themselves. On this side are more specific performance-based words, action-oriented words that are measurable, that are observable, that you can use in writing your objectives, such as solving a problem, writing, stating, listing, drawing. Those sorts of things are observable or quantifiable. You can actually measure those. And so that's something to remember for goals and objectives. It says participants can zoom in to make the view on the slides better. So you might be, oh yeah, using the plus or minus icon. Thank you, Anastasia, for noting that. So you can zoom in on these. But also they're listed separately for you on my website, so you have more time to look them over as well as print them out if you'd like. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I see the zoom in now. So let's do a poll. I want to do 2 quick polls with you, if we can. So if I can get help on this. The first poll question is, let me see if I can I still see my slides? Well, I'm going to read this to you. Just give me a second here. What I want you to do for this first poll activity is answer these questions are these instructional objectives, not goals, but are these objectives, just like we were talking? Just either give me a yes or no. And in the chat box, you can give me the important question, why? Why do you think either yes, it's an objective, or no, it's not? So this, let me see if I can get back to my slides. I'm seeing the poll. Oh, there we go. First one is students will understand English. Is that a objective? Yes or no? And you can put in the chat box why. Oh, and I see that you are, as I'm looking at the polls, I see how this is going. You're answering all those questions right now. So go ahead and, I don't know, Anastasia, how this actually works in terms of.
Dear participants, please answer questions in the poll. Not in the chat, but in the polls as well. Please choose the variant, yes or no. There are just several questions.
Okay, and if they want to give the answer as to why, they can put it in the chat box. And then also, do they have, Anastasia, do they have all of the questions in front of them?
All of the questions are in one poll, so they can scroll in and answer all the questions.
Oh, okay. Okay, I'm seeing that you're answering the questions. Some of you are. And so most of you, for the first one, students will understand English, will develop an appreciation of music, and the teacher will conduct a lecture, are saying these are no. And so or the last one, teachers will conduct a lecture. Most of you are saying yes, that is a proper objective. The others you're saying no to. And so I am going to show you the answers and explain as to why they are or are not the answers. And I'm trying to get back to my PowerPoint. Okay, and so students will understand English. Most are saying no by almost double. Students will appreciate music, are saying yes. That is an objective, and teachers will conduct a lesson. Most of you have said yes, that is an objective. And so I will come back to the other poll questions later. But here are the answers. No, as many of you have said, students will understand English, because understand, as I said, is not measurable. The next one, will appreciate music. No, that's because appreciation itself is not specific. You can't measure appreciation in and of itself. Teachers will conduct a lecture. Most of you had said that that is a good objective, and probably because it said conduct a lecture, and lecture is observable, but the answer is no. It was a bit of a tricky question, and the reason why, and I'm going to go into this, I didn't really explain this, because this is, while it can be viewed as an objective, good objectives are student-based, student-focused, not teacher-focused. This focuses on the teacher, not the student, what the teacher will do, not what the student will do. Good objectives do that. So here for the other poll question, it's all in one. And you see where it says here, students will be able to, that is focusing in on the students. And that's what a good objective does. That's why the other one on the teacher was a bit of a trick question. Sorry to do that. But it's not the ideal objective to ask. You want to focus on what the students will know and do. And are these all good objectives, yes or no? Act out verbal phrases, write a letter, or correctly solve 8 out of 10 true-false questions. And Anastasia, if you could pull up the poll for me on my screen again. I'm not exactly sure how to do that, so I can see what the results are. Well, I don't have the results, the poll results in front of me right now. But let's see what the answer is to these. How many of you put yes? How many of you put no? If this is good instructional objectives. Yes, they all are good. And if that's what most of you have put, because acting out for the first one, writing and correctly solving are all observable and measurable. So good. So what I'd like to do is, in closure now, in the few minutes that I have left, I want to pull all of this together and the things that we've been talking about today as it ties into language and culture as we've been talking about. So the clear objectives that, goals and objectives that we just talked about allow for dialogue, allow for students to be able to show what they're able to do. And then, through inquiry and listening to one another and seeing what the similarities and differences are, that is something that we can be doing as well. And that ties into the Venn diagram that we've talked about. And dialoguing and listening also is speaking and listening is so vital for particularly foreign language students. We need to do more of that. In order for us to have a culture within our own classroom where we can share these different opinions and take risks in asking questions and maybe getting it right, maybe getting it wrong, we as teachers need to create, as it says here, a safe space or environment, and where trust and respect, not only between teacher and student, but student and student takes place. So in our lessons, in our delivery of our lessons, what kind of culture within the classroom itself are we creating to allow for appreciation of differences, as it says in the last bullet, experience and cultures that we come from, our own cultural upbringing. We have different ways of interacting, of understanding. Some of us from our cultures speak up more than others, work better in groups than others. We have to understand and appreciate that as best we can. As well. And then in summation, I don't know how many of you are familiar with culturally responsive teaching, or CRT. Here in the United States, we've been using it for a while, and it is a very important aspect that we are trying to incorporate into our classrooms, similar to what I just talked about in the previous slide, where teachers, if we're trying to work in the areas of cultural appreciation and diversity, we ourselves need to be sensitive to cultural differences in learning, different learning styles, and appreciate and celebrate the similarities and differences that we have within our cultures. Become familiar with the backgrounds of our students and their cultural upbringing themselves, so we can use that knowledge to adapt and monitor and adjust our instruction to best meet the needs of those students. So with that, I thank you. Again, there's my website. And also one thing also I want to say is if you look on my website under the lesson development area, you will find another section on, it's called lesson study. That's a whole area that's been developed by the Japanese on how to use your lessons, and it's a professional development opportunity for teachers to help each other in developing better lessons and delivering better lessons. So feel free to look at that as well. But thank you for your time, your sharing. This has been a wonderful experience for me. I hope it's been good for you as well. Thank you. I appreciate our time together as well.
Well, thank you very much, Rob. And somebody's saying that the baby's crying and it's time to go to sleep. So I hope we'll see our participants at the next webinar, which will be next week, and we'll say goodbye. And if you have some more questions, you can still post your questions in the chat, and Rob will be here for another couple of minutes.
Yes, I'll be glad to answer any questions. I will look on those questions now. And again, thank you all for taking the time to be with us.